is anti-Semitism and the Jewish question in the high politics of the late Stalin period. And I got interested in this because of writing that book there, on Stalin's team, The Years of Living Dangerously in Soviet Politics. That book covers the subject of the group closest around Stalin, what Libniuk calls the inner circle, and I call the team, which formed in the late 1920s and existed until, not only until Stalin's death in 1953, but afterwards, as the collective leadership. In other words, the коллективное руководство, which is the team without Stalin. And that I'm not going to talk about that today, but that was a big surprise to me because of my recognition that actually this team without Stalin, whom many people had regarded simply as yes men for Stalin, were apparently capable not only of maintaining stability after Stalin's death, which many people expected would not be possible, but also undertaking wide-ranging reforms almost immediately. However, I'm not going to go into that particularly in this lecture. That's just to tell you what the scope of the book is. The scope of the book goes actually until from the late 20s, approximately from 1927 until 1957, when the team breaks apart. Khrushchev prevails over the rest of the team and labels Molotov and others as the antipartийная группа. So, Stalin and his Politburo, which is more or less the equivalent of the team, generally agreed on major policies. Now, that's not to say that the team were total yes men. Questions would be raised, issues discussed, and conclusions modified. Discussion was particularly strong when different institutional interests were affected. And indeed, the different members of the team tended to represent different institutions. In other words, they had charge of something like the military or industry or the city of Moscow, and they represented the interests of that institution in the Politburo, in the team, and were expected to do so. Now, for all their exalted position, it was dangerous for members of the team to disagree with Stalin. Now, that changed over time. Of course, it became more dangerous during the purges, again more dangerous after the war, but it was never without a certain frisson of danger. So it was dangerous for them to disagree, and they usually did not openly disagree. But on one issue in the post-war period, it looks as if they did disagree with Stalin. Not openly, because of the danger of doing that, but covertly. In other words, silently, or more or less silently, nevertheless, in a manner that Stalin understood to be disagreement, leaving few traces, except for the big footprint of what they did on this issue when Stalin was gone. Now, that issue was anti-Semitism, and specifically the encouragement, the covert encouragement of anti-Semitism on the part of state and party authorities in the post-war years. And that's my topic today. Now, as I said, I got interested in this because of writing on Stalin's team, and particularly because of finding a nice collection of materials in Ergani under the heading Еврейский вопрос. Actually, in a set of files called Национальный вопрос, but it's all еврейский вопрос in there. And the document there that really caught my interest were the interrogations of people arrested in connection with the Жемчужина case. Жемчужина is Molotov's wife, Polina Жемчужина or Polina Molotova. She herself, her testimony is not in this set of materials. It doesn't appear that she confessed to anything important, but all her relatives and her associates were arrested, or not Molotov, but most of her own family and people who worked with her, and they testified. They testified at great length Now she is being, the accusation against her was Zionism, which means being too sympathetic to the Jewish cause and over-identifying as a Jew. Actually, I think this accusation, give or take, I mean, of course, removing the suggestion that this is treacherous, the suggestion that her Jewish identity had become very important to her, I think is correct. I think it had. But the files are quite interesting for several reasons. One, because of the odd trend they take. First of all, they're about Zionism, and then suddenly we switch and it's about her sex life, with testimony, with vivid testimony indeed. The other reason that this particularly struck me was that when Stalin received these reports, he routinely received the reports of such interrogations, but he did not routinely share these with the Politburo, with other members of the team. In this case, he wrote on it to all Politburo members and all secretaries of the Tzekar, just so that everybody could read, including Molotov, about his wife in a sexual context. Anyway, that sparked my interest, partly because of the remarkable nature of the materials, but partly also because I became convinced as I read this interrogation that indeed Polina Žemčužina was very moved by the Jewish cause after the war, and moreover that it seems likely that her attitudes were quite widely shared, including in that very top stratum that I'm looking at. In other words, the team. Just let me, I'll give one little footnote here about why I'm calling it the team and not the Politburo, or the Politburo Presidium. These are nearly the same group. The team I take to be the people who met not only in the formal Politburo members meetings, but also in Stalin's office, 3 or 4 times a week, sometimes more often, together as a group. The group that meets together informally is close to the same constitution, same group as the Politburo, but not entirely, giving Stalin the power to invite or disinvite. In other words, there are Politburo members who at a given time are not invited to these informal meetings. And there are also some people who are not Politburo members, not many, but sometimes, who are invited. So this is the fact that the Politburo and the team, the functioning team, are not identical is, I take it, an aspect of Stalin's exerting of control over his cadres. So to turn now to the question of anti-Semitism. In the 1940s and early 1950s, there is a sharp rise of popular anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union, and then apparently state-sponsored, well, clearly state-sponsored anti-Semitism of a covert type, mainly. And my initial question is, why? Why did this happen? And with regard to state-sponsored anti-Semitism, what was the purpose? Now, breaking down the problem gave me 3 questions to which I wanted answers. And when I say that, I'm really describing the process of writing the chapter in this book. These are the 3 questions I felt I had to sort out for myself, though only the last one is actually, the last 2 are described in the book. So first of all, why in the 1940s do we have this sharp rise of popular anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union? Second question, why do we have the anti-Semitic turn in government and party policy after the war? And third, why did the post-Stalin leadership, the коллективное руководство, the team without Stalin after his death, why did they immediately repudiate the anti-Semitic turn when he died, or attempt to repudiate it? Now, for many scholars, certainly in the West, I think probably also in Russia, the question of my question about why the rise of anti-Semitism in the 1940s might be seen to be a non-question, or that means a non-interesting question, because of the assumption that Russia is always anti-Semitic. Well, yes, perhaps up to a point. But since 1917, since the revolution, the Soviet government and Communist Party had taken a fairly firm line against popular anti-Semitism with reasonable success. Not complete success and not complete consistency, of course, but I think as a generalization, that is accurate. Popular anti-Semitism existed in the 1920s and 1930s, especially in Ukraine, Belarus, southern Russia, and the capitals, Moscow and Leningrad, where the Jewish population congregated. There was a big influx of population from the Pale. But this popular anti-Semitism was kept down, was suppressed. Individual cases were prosecuted or punished by expulsion from the party. Of course, not always, but regularly. The revival in a big way of popular anti-Semitism is, as far as I can see, a phenomenon of the 1940s, the first such occasion since the Civil War at the beginning of the 1920s. In other words, after 20 years. The usual explanation, insofar as one is offered, for the rise of popular anti-Semitism in the 1940s is the influence of Nazi anti-Semitic propaganda in occupied territories and on Soviet soldiers fighting in those territories during the war. Now, no doubt this explanation has some merit, although I'm always a bit puzzled about it. That is, I'm puzzled about how it is that soldiers, I mean, somebody may be able to explain this to me that understands better how things work in armies, but I don't completely understand how Soviet soldiers fighting the Germans should so readily absorb their attitudes on a question like anti-Semitism. Still, perhaps no doubt this is a factor, but it doesn't seem to me to explain the notable rise of anti-Semitism in the Soviet hinterland, that is, in the Soviet Union, far from the areas of occupation, far from also the traditional areas of Jewish settlement. Nor does it explain why the rise of popular anti-Semitism occurs so early in the war. It's noticeable, for example, in Moscow in October 1941. I want to suggest another explanation than the wartime the transmission to the army at the front, which is strangely absent in the discussion so far, as far as I know it, at any rate. That is a demographic explanation. Now, nothing is ever single factor. I'm not saying this is the only factor, but it is a factor that I think needs to be taken into account. So let's consider the situation. In 1939, the Soviet Union acquired territory on the western borderlands, according to the terms of the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, which brought 2 million new Jewish residents, mainly Polish Jews, some Romanian and Baltic, many of whom didn't speak Russian and kept to old religious observances, which Soviet Jews had largely abandoned. It brought these 2 million Jewish residents into the Soviet population. Overnight, as a result, the Jewish proportion of the Soviet population rose from 3 to 5%. This included, the group included some hundreds of thousands of refugees, mainly Jewish, from German-occupied Poland. So that's the first situation, the incorporation of a large new Jewish population that mainly doesn't speak Russian. Then came the German, in 1941, the German occupation of these same territories, plus the rest of Ukraine and Belarus and much of southern Russia, which had their own substantial Jewish population. The result was mass evacuation and flight from these areas, as well as some punitive deportation. So not everybody goes willingly by any means, or voluntarily. But this took a large number of Jews from the area into evacuation, with, of course, lots of other people who are not Jewish, into the Soviet hinterland, to the Urals, Siberia, Kazakhstan, Central Asia. Now this movement, this voluntary and involuntary movement out of the areas occupied by Germany in the early stages of the war, this is a very important movement in the history of European Jewry, because if you were a Jew in Europe, this was actually the most likely way to survive. The most promising way to survive, though it may not have seemed so at the time, was actually to go to the Soviet Union, for all the hardships involved, despite the fact that that some of the people are deported rather than going involuntarily. The largest number of survivors of European Jewry survived by that route and were able to return, the Polish group in particular, to Poland and then subsequently to Western Europe after the war. Now that's a very important story, but it's not my story today. My concern today is the domestic impact of that large-scale evacuation and deportation into the hinterland of Jews from the Western territories. The huge influx of penniless evacuees was a great burden for local administrations, all the more if the evacuees didn't speak Russian and didn't understand Soviet ways of doing things. The situation was made more complicated by elite evacuations, in other words, evacuations of elites from the capitals, which followed a few months later in the autumn of 1941. These people were privileged and had to be treated accordingly by local authorities, causing more strain on the authorities and more resentment. Now, a large number of the privileged group, as well as the poor one from the Western territories, were Jews, both because of overrepresentation, of high representation in the elites, and a greater tendency on the part of Jews to evacuate based on their knowledge of Nazi anti-Semitism. So hence, I would suggest the rise of anti-Semitism so early in the war and so far from the actual war and occupation zones. So let's turn now to anti-Semitism on the part of the state and the Communist Party. Now for some, this why, in other words, why is such anti-Semitism arising, is also a non-question. Because some people would argue that there was always anti-Semitism around in the Bolshevik Party, and particularly in Stalin's faction in it, the one that was successful in the battles of the 1920s. And there is something to this argument. It's true that the party recruited heavily from the lower strata of Russian and Ukrainian population in the Civil War in the 1920s, and that those strata are probably more likely than intelligentsia to be anti-Semitic. It's also true that the faction Stalin fought, in fact Stalin and his team fought and ultimately defeated after Lenin's death, that is Trotsky's group, the Zinoviev Communist group, were mainly Jewish, meaning that locally in those faction struggles there was sometimes an anti-Semitic subtext. In other words, it may not be in the published materials, but almost certainly the Stalin people were sometimes saying locally of the Trotsky people, they're all Jews, so don't go with them. It's also true that certain Soviet and party policies of the 1920s took them into touchy areas with regard to anti-Semitism. For example, the drive against netmen could be interpreted and was sometimes in Belarus and Ukraine as a drive against, specifically against Jewish netmen. The proletarian affirmative action in education program that privileges workers, but it discriminates against non-workers and many of them Jewish. And we might also note that the anti-elite aspect of the great purges of the late 1930s was likely also to have, on occasion, anti-Semitic overtones because of the high Jewish representation in the political elite, which was the target. Nevertheless, despite all those things that I've just listed, suggesting the possibility of anti-Semitism in party circles. Nevertheless, anti-Semitism, the opposition to anti-Semitism, the condemnation of anti-Semitism, was a core value for Bolsheviks, along with their opposition to, of the same level, I would suggest, as their opposition to religion, their support of science, their support of workers, industrialization, and so on. And that core value was still there in the pre-war period. When state and party policies provoked anti-Semitic side effects, this was punished and discouraged. Now, it's notable that in the Great Purges, when certain minority nationalities were specially targeted as groups, for example, Poles, Germans, Koreans, Jews were not specially targeted as groups. Those that were targeted were what Terry Martin has called the diaspora nationalities. In other words, members of national minorities that had a nation state outside the Soviet Union to which they might, in principle, they might be feared to give their loyalty. Now, Jews with no external state at this point were not a diaspora nationality and were not targeted as such. Now, note also that on the eve of the war, the Bolshevik Party still had higher representation of Jews than their population share would predict, and the same is true of all elite markers. In fact, the figures are quite striking. As of 1949, 17% of Soviet Jews had higher education. That's 8 times the rate of the whole population and almost 5 times the urban population of the Soviet Union as a whole. Moreover, that is a higher representation of higher educated persons among Jewish population than existed in any other country at the same time. With regard to elite positions, in 1948, Jews were 3 to 4 times as likely as the population as a whole to have jobs in the party or state apparat, 10 times as likely to be scientists or working in higher education. Now, in the following decade, that is 49 to 59, the numbers in party and state apparat dropped by more than 2/3. This is a result, of course, of the covert anti-Semitic campaign. But the numbers of Jews in science and academia rose by almost the same amount in absolute figures, that is 11 to 12,000. Now, certainly Central Committee representation of Jews dropped sharply, as also Supreme Soviet deputies, these sort of visible marks of status were telling the story that Jews are being sidelined. As for the top leadership, the very top, the team that I'm talking about, the point is often made that Lazar Kaganovich was the only Jewish Politburo member in the 1930s and 40s. That is 1 out of about 10. But this overlooks the fact that in Stalin's inner circle, in the team, half the wives were Jewish. Molotov's, Andreas, Verdashil's, Kaganovich in the post-war lot. Earlier, Kirov's wife, Kuibishev's wives, or one of Kuibishev's wives at any rate. And even those who didn't have Jewish wives often had Jewish sons and daughters-in-law. That's true of Stalin himself, of Khrushchev, Malenkov. And Malenkov is interesting because sometimes when people talk about the team and speculate on support within it for the anti-Semitic campaign, Malenkov is, as Stalin's executive right-hand man, is often mentioned. But I think that we have to remember about Malenkov, who's Russian, that not only did his Jewish son-in-law, the son of one of his closest friends and work associates, live with him in the same household, but that son-in-law was the grandson of Solomon Lazovsky, who was the leading party expert on Jewish affairs and who was arrested and charged and executed in 1942 in the trial of the Jewish in the case of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, which I'll talk about later. In other words, Malenkov, if we're talking about Jewish connections, Malenkov certainly had them, and of the kind that could be held against him, that could be held over him, in fact. Now, on the question of the rise of state and party anti-Semitism, Stalin's paranoia is often cited as a reason. Now, to my mind, this has little explanatory force. There's no doubt that Stalin was getting more paranoid about enemies, or rather, his paranoia, which went up and down, was on an uptrend. But I don't think his paranoia was out of control, or at least I think that he sometimes would let it out for a run, so to speak, rather than being, which is a sort of calculated out of controlness. In any case, paranoid he may have been, but why particularly against Jews? We're told that he would make anti-Semitic remarks in private, but that he would get furious with anybody in his circle who repeated this, or whose public actions or statements could lend credibility to accusations of Soviet anti-Semitism. So no doubt he's worried about foreign reaction. That's always a factor with Stalin, especially in this period. But there's also clearly a domestic concern not to be seen as anti-Semitic. There are very curious accounts from several sources about remarks that Stalin let drop in the discussion for the Stalin Prize, where intelligentsia leaders and some party leaders, including Stalin, took part, when people told him of instances of anti-Semitism. This is 1950-52, this kind of time. They told him of instances of anti-Semitism, and he said, "Oh, that's terrible. Well, I'll have to see that something's done about that." And temporarily, those witnesses, Simonov and Khadyanikov from the Soyuz Kompositov, they accepted that Stalin didn't know about the anti-Semitism and would do something about it. Only later did it strike them that this was simply, he was being disingenuous. He was trying to get them to put out the actually false message that he was not connected with the anti-Semitic campaign. And I won't go on at too great length about this, but I would note that the press coverage is extremely odd in the late in the late 40s and early 50s. You have no overt anti-Semitism, no discussion about how Jews are a problem, nothing like that. But what you do have is news items about Jews who have done anti-Soviet things like speculation, and they are identified as Jews not by saying this man is a Jew, but by saying Isaac Abramovich, whatever. In other words, giving a name that is to be identified as, that clearly the readership will take to be Jewish. So there's covert anti-Semitism, but it's interesting that it is so covert, that it is so careful to avoid the overt aspect, even after the arrest of the doctors in the doctor's floor. So, in considering the question of state and party anti-Semitism, clearly the rise of popular anti-Semitism is salient, since popular anti-Semitism or popular attitudes of any kind quickly bleed into attitudes on the part of lower level administration. In addition, the top leadership had the incentive to play to popular anti-Semitism. But this temptation had been resisted before, so why not now? I want to talk now about the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee and the support of Israel during the war. And the first point to make here is that Soviet top-level attitude to Jews that, during the war was in many ways a favorable one. Leading Jewish public figures like Solomon Michaels and Peretz Markish were concerned in 1940 about the situation of Polish Jewish refugees and the others from their newly acquired territories, and they had extremely good access in high places. Among their patrons, among the people they could go to with their concerns, were Molotov, Kalinin, Beria, Voroshilov, Kaganovich, and Zhdanov. That is most of the important people on the team. And I take that from the Anti-Fascist Committee archives, among other sources. Their concerns about these, about the Jews, the plight of Jews in the newly Jews in the newly acquired territories and refugees from Jews in territories, Polish territories acquired by Germany, are one aspect of the prehistory of the formation of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, formally constituted in 1942. Now, this committee was an anomalous institution in Soviet terms because the Soviet system usually did not allow for non-governmental interest group representation. However, during the war, exceptions were made, and the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee was one of a group of anti-fascist committees. Women, scientists, youth, and Slavs are the other categories, set up at the same time, whose primary purpose was to appeal to particular international constituencies for fundraising and propaganda purposes. Now, of these committees, the Jewish one was by far the most successful, raising, successful and visible and active, raising $10 million from American Jews for the Soviet war effort. Now, there was, of course, a problem with that success. The likelihood of suspicion that the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee was getting too close to the American capitalists who gave the money. Another problem, born of success, was that the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee became such an active defender of Jewish interests domestically. I'm talking about issues like evacuation problems, return from evacuation, getting your apartment back, getting into higher education, and so on. They were so active in the defense that, as some critics start to comment, they started to look like a Ministry of Jewish Affairs. Emboldened by success and struck by the confluence of the wartime deportation of Tatars from the Crimea, freeing up territory, and an influx of Jewish refugees who needed a territory, the Anti-Fascist Committee raised again the old question from the 1920s of creating a Jewish republic in the Crimea, pointing out that American Jews would put up the money. This idea had some supporters, or at least tentative supporters, in the team, in the top leadership, including Molotov. But Stalin was against. From his standpoint, and you can see why he thought this, it looked too like an American capitalist beachhead in a strategically sensitive region. Internationally, the struggle for the creation of the State of Israel was an important issue, the Soviet Union being one of Israel's first and most important backers. The new state came into being in 1948, and in September of that year, Golda Meir arrived as Israel's first diplomatic representative in Moscow. She was greeted with huge enthusiasm by crowds at the Moscow synagogue, something that was bound to cause trouble with Stalin and the leadership, and also by Žemčužina, by Polina Molotova, Molotov's wife, who embraced her at a diplomatic reception at her home, her Molotov's home, saying, in Yiddish, I am a daughter of the Jewish people. Now, Golda Meir's memoirs admit that meeting, but don't admit to subsequent meetings which others claim took place. This may be because Golda Meir was being, as she admits in the 1970s, still careful about what she said about her meetings with Soviet citizens. At this time, when the Israeli embassy is being set up, state and party policy was already taking the anti-Semitic turn, with Jews being dropped from government offices, quotas keeping down numbers in higher education. The Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee's wartime American connections were a predictable object of suspicion as the Cold War intensified. And note also that when the State of Israel came into being in 1948, Soviet Jews became, for the first time, a diaspora nationality. In other words, they had a homeland outside to which they might be suspected of giving allegiance. The Anti-Fascist Committee's president, Michaels, died in suspicious circumstances early in 1948. In addition, the so-called anti-cosmopolitan campaign, originally directed against unwary Soviet contacts with foreigners in general, soon in practice acquired anti-Semitic overtones. The Meir legation, Golda Meir legation, quickly became aware of this and aware that Jews, however enthusiastic, were frightened of contacting them. Moreover, there were big unresolvable issues in the Soviet-Israeli relationship. The first one, that the US, the Soviet antagonist in the burgeoning Cold War, had become Israel's major financial backer. The second one, that the Soviet government, always strongly against immigration, was not going to allow an exception for its Jewish citizens. except for the Polish Jews who had come in briefly during the war, while Israel desperately wanted immigrants. In other words, Israel's wish for money and people were not things that the Soviet Union was able to satisfy. The Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee survived several attempts to dissolve it. Note, I'm slightly reversing the usual way of putting it. The usual way of putting it was dissolved naturally, because of it arising suspicion. I note, however, that several attempts were made. It came to the Politburo several times before it went through, and I take this to be an indicator of the strength of its support in the Politburo. But it was finally dissolved in November 1948, just before the arrest of Jemczugina for Zionism. Now, among other things, Jemczugina, in those interrogations of her associates I talked about, was said to have hinted in private conversation that Stalin was responsible for Mikhail's death. I doubt that she actually made such hints to the people who claimed that she did, because she wouldn't have been so rash. She didn't know them well enough. But it may well have been what she and others thought in private, including in the team. And as we now know, they were right. In other words, this murder was ordered by Stalin. Next thing to add to the mix is the question of post-war tensions in the leadership. Stalin had been sniping at Molotov, his number two, since the end of the war, and their relations further deteriorated in 1949 with Jemczugina's arrest and Molotov's removal from the position of Minister of Foreign Affairs. The nadir was reached in October 1952, when at a plenary meeting of the Central Committee, Stalin launched a vicious attack on Molotov and Anastas Mikoyan, suggesting they might be imperialist spies. He said Molotov had wanted to give Crimea to the Jews, unquote, and told his wife what went on in the Politburo. At this same time, now Molotov and Mikoyan, strangely enough, are left as members of the Presidium, which is what the Politburo is called at this time, though they are not included in a new body called the Bureau of the Presidium. But an important question was, of course, the informal meetings of the because that was where that was really the heart of the team life. And what is interesting there is that while Stalin stopped inviting them, they kept coming, at least for some months. And the reason that they were able to keep coming was that other members of the team, as Khrushchev tells in his memoirs, and that's confirmed by other sources, other memoir sources, told them when these meetings were. It's very strange behavior in terms of what we assume about the relations of Stalin and his team. Despite this, it was generally thought that Molotov and Mikoyan were doomed men. And Beria also seems to have regarded himself as in mortal danger from Stalin. All of them seem to have suspected that at this period, as indicated by his discussion of radical political reform on the agenda at the October plenum of 1952, all of them seem to have suspected that Stalin had something like a replay of the Great Purges of the late 1930s in mind, with them in the role of enemies of the people, in other words, Molotov and Mikoyan, so to speak, in the Bukhar and so on role. Now to 1952, and which is the height of state and party anti-Semitism. Because of ill health and diminished energy, Stalin in this period, in the period 1950-52, spent almost half his time outside Moscow in the south, hence out of direct supervision of government. But when he came back from his long period, his 7 months away in 1951 to 52, came back in February, he stayed. He didn't go on his usual summer vacation. This surely was because he had so much urgent business to attend to, notably revamping the leadership and directing the anti-Semitic campaign, which seems to have been his personal concern. In May of that year, the leaders of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, plus Lozovsky, who had been the man they reported to, Molotov's deputy, the grandfather of Malenkov's son-in-law, etc., they were put on trial for Zionism and treason in a closed military tribunal. Now, this trial followed a pattern familiar from the late 30s, though it was not as public as those trials. In other words, confessions obtained from police interrogation were the basis of the accusation, and they described a network of conspiracy among the people on trial. Now, this time, although there was a major hitch in the process. The trial, as I've said, it wasn't public, but it was held in the Lubyanka and open to employees of the security services, and I assume also other elite members. And the important thing to notice about it is it went haywire, and that information has to have got out. First of all, Lazovsky, the main defender, retracted his confession in court. And went on to make a mockery of the accusations in a way that that Bukharin tried to also, in his trial back in '38, didn't work. But with Lazovsky it did work, partly because the judge just let him talk. And his speech is extremely effective. And it affected the other defendants, and they started to retract their confessions too. Now, the most remarkable thing is that the judge, Alexander Chubtsov, a man who appears to have been of impeccable Stalinist credentials, not only failed to shut Lazovsky up, to stop him talking, but he sent a message to Malenkov, Stalin's close associate, but also I think Chubtsov's friend and colleague from earlier days in the Central Committee apparat. He sent a message that, in his opinion, there was no substance to the accusations and the defendants ought to be acquitted. Now, this didn't happen. Malenkov didn't give the message to Stalin. The defenders, after Chubtsov held it up for a month, but then he convicted them, and they were convicted and they were shot. So the outcome is not strange, but what is really strange is the fact that Chubtsov dared to do this. I don't see any signs if somebody knows something about him and can tell me he was a closet liberal, okay. But it doesn't look to me that that was the situation. I can only assume that his motives in acting as he did were probably not as a result of principle or legalistic enthusiasm or whatever, but more likely because he knew that opinion at the top in the team, in Stalin's close associates, was divided on the anti-Semitic campaign, and he was either hedging his bets or throwing in his lot with those who didn't agree with Stalin's prosecution of this campaign. Now, Stalin, still potentially lethal at this point, but also increasingly treated by his team as a difficult paterfamilias prone to irrational suspicions, launched a new attack in the winter of 1952-53, using a new team from the security services as the old stalwarts, many of them Jewish, in the security services had let him down, and bypassing the Politburo, bypassing the team in the so-called doctors' plot, by which a group of Kremlin doctors were charged, and this was published in Pravda, with conspiring to kill Soviet leaders on the instructions of American intelligence. Now, almost all the doctors were Jewish, as their names conveyed to a Russian audience, and that point was underlined by mentioning the participation of the American Jewish Agency Joint, a major partner in the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee wartime fundraising. Now, while the press continued, as I've said, to avoid anything overtly anti-Semitic, this was not so in the party meetings held all over the Soviet Union to discuss, to draw itogi from the communique about the doctor's plot. It was clear that a major offensive against the Jews was underway. Rumors, which have not been confirmed in the archives, flew around that the Jews were all to be deported to distant parts of the Soviet Union, as had happened during the war to the Crimean Tatars and others. Now, this deportation was a course that many who took part in the discussions in the oblasts eagerly recommended. Stalin was the hands-on director of the Doctors' Plot campaign. But remarkably, it appears that everyone else on his team, that is, all the rest of the Politburo Presidium members, was to some degree against it, although they kept quiet, because it was too dangerous to disagree with Stalin on an issue he considered of core importance. the best evidence for their opposition is the fact that the moment Stalin died, which incredibly conveniently for everyone on the team happened in March 1953, his successors immediately, that is within 3 weeks, tried to draw a halt to the anti-Semitic campaign, announcing, not only releasing the doctors, but announcing in the press that they had been exonerated. So that is the major evidence for the team's disagreement, if silent, on this issue with Stalin. The other evidence for this is the statements made by members of the team in the various acrimonious discussions in the party leadership in 1953, 1956, and 1957. In these discussions between members of the team, lots of accusations were thrown around, but what is interesting is that that nobody seems to contest the fact that the team as a whole were not in sympathy with Stalin's anti-Semitic campaign. The strongest accusations made are about cowardice for remaining silent about this disagreement, not co-responsibility with Stalin for the anti-Semitic campaign. That made it almost unique in the post-Stalin discussion of Stalin's crimes. Almost always when a crime is identified, the finger is pointed often at Molotov or Beria or whomever, and often the person at whom the finger is pointed tried to point the finger somewhere else. The anti-Semitic campaign is the one issue on which this doesn't happen. So in conclusion, concluding hypotheses, Stalin was the main and probably the only proponent of state party anti-Semitism in the very top leadership. The others were against it, silently, but we knew they were against it, I think. The Jewish issue was entangled in tensions within the leadership, with Stalin trying to get rid of some, and perhaps most, or even all, of the old team that had been with him since the 1920s and 1930s. So we have a why question, a question about Stalin's motives in pushing the anti-Semitic campaign, and also the motives of the rest of the team for their apparent disagreement. Stalin's motives first. Cold War is one possible explanation. It seems clear that Stalin thought that the Jews, including Soviet Jews, regarded America as their savior. The logic of the Cold War, therefore, Jews can be seen, I think Stalin did see Jews as a potential fifth column. That's what he said to his colleagues in private on the only issue when they seem to have formally discussed the anti-Semitic campaign in December 1952, noting that he said they were as credulous as kittens about enemies. In other words, they didn't recognize Jews in this capacity. It's very likely, I think, that Stalin was planning a leadership purge. In that case, this approach fits those purges he had previously used to get rid of political opponents. The strategy had been, on several previous occasions, tar the political opponents with association with privileged groups resented within the society, stir up indignation against these groups, and hence the leaders in question. Now, an example, I can say more about this in question if you want. An example would be the way that he got rid of the right, the Bukharinites, at the end of the 1920s, when they are tarred by association with so-called bourgeois specialists. In other words, privileged intellectuals, most of them non-communist. Another example, I think, would be the way of getting rid of much of the upper echelon in the party, except for the very top stratum of the team in the Great Purges, where the strategy was to indicate that these enemies of the people holding official positions had great privilege within the society. The newspapers described this in detail, which they had abused. In other words, stirring up popular resentment of the privilege of the Chancellor. If Stalin was planning a leadership purge in 1952, which I think he very likely was, the likelihood is that the popular resentment against privilege he was hoping to harness this time was resentment of the privileges of Jewish elite members. Now, what about the motives of the team? The team had gone very far before with Stalin, even when they themselves were potentially at risk. The Great Purges is an example. But this time, the risk was greater and more immediate. Possibly, they simply saw this as a bridge too far. In other words, one step further than they felt ready to go. But that has to be linked, I think, with their consciousness of Stalin's growing weakness. Now, growing weakness doesn't mean that he wasn't still lethal, that he couldn't still kill them, that he couldn't still push his own particular projects. But his physical and mental stamina was greatly reduced, his workday cut down drastically, his periods of recuperation in the South ever greater. The others may have thought he was losing his touch or wasn't long for this world, and that the anti-Semitic campaign was an example of him losing his touch. Now, we could also speculate that conceivably the core beliefs of the team, who after all are Bolsheviks from way back, were offended by the anti-Semitic campaign. Now, I don't want to give them too much credit because my study of them in this book didn't lead me to fall in love with them. But the speed with which the anti-Semitic campaign was called off, the doctors released and publicly exonerated, is extraordinary. Now, Beria, as head of the security services, spearheaded this, but the rest of the team supported it. In a period when they were desperately trying to keep things stable and win legitimacy, it was a big risk, as one can see from the press that they received from it. I mean, not the press, the letters, the correspondence from members of the public. Popular opinion soundings and reports from lower-level party organizations showed widespread and strong negative reactions to the release of the doctors charged in the doctors' plot. Many people wrote that they felt that the accusations against Jewish doctors had all the more credibility now that Stalin too had died. No doubt if they had, as after all it was said he was killing leaders, and here he was killed. Now, many people who wrote in wondered if new leaders, especially the relatively unknown Beria and Malenkov, were Jewish. Lots of leaders simply say, is Malenkov a Jew, is Beria a Jew? They also wondered if this was actually a Jewish coup at the top, or the result of some kind of treasonous deal with the United States made by Stalin's team without Stalin. So either, I conclude, the team, in trying to call a halt to the anti-Semitic campaign, made a major political miscalculation because it cost them a lot, or they thought halting the anti-Semitic campaign was important enough to justify the spending of political capital. In the event, the political transition after Stalin's death was successfully accomplished, but the effort to repudiate anti-Semitism only partially. Anti-Semitism turned out to be a genie that couldn't be put back into the bottle at home. In other words, you let it out on the leash and you couldn't pull it back again. It was a gift to the other side in the Cold War. It was a violation of core principles of the Bolshevik Party that tarnished the party in the eyes of many of its own members, including perhaps even the team. And on top of that, it was the cause of a parting of the ways between regime and the Russian intelligentsia that proved to be permanent. In other words, I conclude that this was not only a disaster, but probably an avoidable one, and that it was Stalin's last gamble gone wrong. Thank you.